My name is Myra Spencer. I'm 36 years old, and I've worked at 3 a.m. sewing clothes for strangers without clapping. A year after my divorce, I was finishing my shift near the maternity ward when I saw my ex-mother-in-law in the elevator. Carol Bishop was smiling like a doorbell. She came right up to me on Sunday, so happy and so loud the nurses could hear her. "My son was the best decision you ever made," she said. "Now he has a son with your best friend." I was labeled devastated for 6 whole years in one sentence. I didn't look at her, I just stared at her, the silence like a melody, and said, "Can you believe this?" 5 minutes later, someone neither she nor my best friend expected walked in through that door. A name no one wants to write will be read out immediately in court. Welcome to a quiet drama of women facing brutality, a reality that never ends, but isn't inevitable. If you're a fan of quiet justice, tune in. Leave a comment and let me know where you're listening, and don't forget to subscribe. Let me rewind about 5 minutes, because the smile was coming from the man's face. It was a Thursday, near the end of a 12-hour shift, and I was handing a card to a night nurse named Theo. The maternity ward was at the end of the corridor, leading to the emergency room where I worked, and I had passed it hundreds of times without giving it a second thought. Carol was there to ask me. Of course she was. Paige had given birth 3 weeks earlier, and the entire Bishop neighborhood in town was filled with balloons and jars. I knew it. I'd prepared myself for it, but I hadn't prepared for Carol to come to me, as if she'd been waiting all afternoon. She looked me up and down, taking in my clothes and my tired eyes, then lifted her chin. Then she repeated the phrase she had said before about her daughter, her young child, and my best friend. Theo walked quietly beside me. A passing assistant slowed her pace, and I felt my thumb brush against my grandfather's delicate gold watch on my wrist. I pressed the screen, as I had done since childhood, waiting for something I could not yet change. I didn't raise my voice. I learned long ago that the loudest person in a room rarely tells the truth. "Do you believe that?" I asked him again, this time slowly. Carol closed her eyes, enveloped in silence. She had expected tears, or anger, or at least shock, but she didn't understand anything that was happening. Somewhere down that corridor, 2 automatic doors swung open, though I hadn't turned around to see yet. I didn't know who was coming, but I knew what had started all this. Before things get any clearer, here's something you should know about me. I grew up in a farming town in southern Ohio, the kind of place where everyone's work was everyone else's goal. My mother cleaned the house, my father drove a food truck until his back ached. I worked 2 jobs during college and 2 more during medical school, and I learned to stay humble and let my work speak for itself. This has been my philosophy for most of my life. When I do my job well in silence, the truth speaks for itself. People see your true self clearly. I think some people happily believe that. This was helpful to me when I was in the hospital in a difficult situation where you don't panic and can't justify yourself. You fix what's in front of you and move on to the next situation. The smell of the place, the smell of clean cotton and disinfectant that fills everything in the hospital, comforts me every time I enter. This meant I was in a place where I felt comfortable, a place where no one had ever told me I was flawed. I could use a code, splint my shoulder, and persuade a frightened child to start sewing, all without my heart pounding. But that same instinct, which caused me so much anxiety, had a dark side. I bore it all alone. I didn't ask for help. When people started telling me lies, I had made the worst mistake a quiet woman could make. I thought silence would be enough. The only place where no one dared call me a whore was the hospital. The rest of my life was a different story. When I turned 28, I married Mark Bishop. He possessed a charm that made strangers feel special. He remembered names. He shook hands with everyone as if they were shaking his. Half the neighborhood attested to this, and in the early years, they supported him. We longed to have children. We tried for a long time, but to no avail. Unhappiness was present in our home like a stranger. About 2 years later, I did what any doctor would do. I suggested we run some tests, simple blood work and a basic examination, the kind I always recommend to my patients. Mark refused. At first, he laughed, then he was shocked. He said that Episcopal priests didn't have such problems. He summed it up with a short talk about faith and how we should trust in God. I pushed him once. I pushed him twice. Then I let him go, because I didn't want to bring a grown man into the clinic, and I believe that silence is a form of patience. I went and had the tests done. My results came back completely normal. I remember sitting in my car in the clinic parking lot, reading the newspaper, feeling both relieved and confused at the same time. What if it wasn't me? I couldn't find answers. I couldn't force myself to. The longer I was without her, the easier it became for those around me to write their own stories. At that moment, Mark began to say things, quiet things, first to his mother. Maybe the problem was with me. Maybe I simply couldn't. I hadn't realized the power of silence when the right person chose to keep that lie. Carol Bishop led her church's ladies' club with the same fervor she had used to lead the general election campaign. She buried her young husband and raised Mark alone, a testament to the fact that her son hadn't let her down during those difficult years. He was perfect because he had to be. Otherwise, what was the point of all this sacrifice? When Mark whispered that I might be the problem, Carol didn't hesitate for a moment. She picked him up and ran. He started as a tiny seed, a sigh of pity after the stew, a hand on someone's arm, a faint voice. Poor Mark. He loved children so much. Then she had her teeth pulled. At a church dinner that autumn, she introduced me to the wife of a visiting minister with her usual expression of sympathy. "This is Myra, my son's wife," she said. "She's a doctor, you know. I feel so sorry for the children." The woman nodded sadly, as if she knew what I was saying, and I realized then that the whole story I'd been told had crumbled before my eyes. I stood there in my formal dress, holding a paper plate, and Carol waved her hand as if I needed comforting. Then she said something she'd wanted to say for years, something she said others would pray for. Some women just don't know how to do that. She smiled as she said it. She believed it. That was the worst part. She wasn't being mean. She repeated what her son had told her clearly and confidently, avoiding any discussion of the details, unaware that his words were lies. I didn't tell Mark anything on the way home that night. I should have told him, but I was waiting for the truth to come out. Paige Dolan had been my best friend since we were 15. We met in high school chemistry class and watched everything unfold from afar. We shared my college days, her long career, and moved between 2 states. Our relationship spanned 12 years. She was the one I called when my father passed away. She stood at my wedding in a green dress and wept as I recited my vows. When church sermons began to affect me, she was the one I turned to. She would come and leave me with a glass of wine, and she always knew what to say. Or so I thought. Looking back, every word of comfort she gave me was different. "Myra, you're very talented. Maybe this isn't your path. Mark will love you. Don't let his mother get in your way. You don't have to be a child to be a complete child." Kind words, all of them, but they always cause the same pain. They always remind me of something I missed. At the time, I didn't realize how often her eyes were darting towards Mark across the room, or how she was beginning to know his intentions that I hadn't told her about. I was too busy being grateful for someone who seemed not to judge me. She would sit on my living room sofa and tell me I deserved better than her, and I would shake my head in denial. I never imagined she would enter my life. People like Paige don't take what's yours all at once. They take it gradually until one day you discover they are exactly who you thought they were. I believed him completely. That was the second mistake I'd ever made. Mark filed for divorce on Tuesday. When I got home from work, I found a handmade envelope on the kitchen table and an empty cupboard. He hadn't even waited to tell me. Over the weekend, he'd moved into Paige's apartment across town, and that was that. History for me. The story being told was harsh and cruel. Myra was cold and distant. Myra was dedicated to her work. Myra couldn't bear him children, and a person needs a family, doesn't everyone? Carol made her presence felt, and Paige, my own Paige, didn't correct me at all. The 2 people who had known me for a long time had warned me, and I hadn't argued, because I felt I was doing my duty to the fullest. I didn't post a single word online. I didn't call anyone to defend myself. The next morning, I went to work and treated a little boy's broken arm, telling him he'd be okay, and he was. And I felt like that was the only real thing I'd done all week. If you've ever lied to yourself just to keep the peace, or keep your family together, or keep your friendships, or keep the reputation you've built over the years, you know exactly what that feels like. It tastes like blood, and you're not allowed to spit it out. Stay here with me because I'm beginning to understand something. The peace I cherished so much wasn't mine. Someone lied to me about myself. They were the ones who needed my silence. If you had been there, you would have spoken the truth, and the silence wouldn't have lasted, because it wouldn't have lasted. I want to tell you the story of the day the hospital board taught me that it's okay to speak up. It's not about my marriage anymore, it's about the day I was admitted to the hospital. I'd been a candidate for the emergency room job for years. I'd developed trauma protocols that are now used by half the county's population. The job was just as important as my own, and everyone knew it. Then the rumors reached the accreditation committee. There was no truth to them, not a single grain of truth, just the appearance of it. Dr. Spencer's personal life was unstable, and there were questions about her judgment. Had you heard about the divorce? What was her husband's family saying? One of the board members, who played golf with Uncle Mark, started asking direct questions about my ability to lead under pressure. I wish I hadn't sat there for 10 years while people bled at my desk. When the job was advertised, someone with half my time and no protocol contacted me. He told me I was a strong candidate. He said the decision was difficult. He didn't tell me exactly why, but I grew up in a small town. I recognized the sound of a sentence veiled in gratitude. Something inside me changed that night. Her lies about my body cost me my marriage, and I left her because I thought her patience was the right thing to do. But now, that lie had reached a point where I wouldn't let anyone touch me. My job, my name, who I've become. Just as I sat in my car in the hospital parking lot, and just as I had sat in my usual office years before, I realized that the silence I had prided myself on had paid off, and that someone else was quietly paying the price. The nurse I trusted gave me the name of a lawyer named Ruth Calloway. Ruth's office was above a hardware store. She wore reading glasses perched on her gray hair, and her gaze suggested she was 3 steps ahead of you. I told her everything: the marriage, the church talk, the counseling, the job I lost. Lawyers rarely do that. When I finished, she put her pen down. "What you're describing could be defamation," she said. "It could be a lie, but I'm not lying to you. It's serious." She made it perfectly clear. To win, we have to prove 3 things. First, that a specific false statement was made. Second, that it spread among others. And third, that it caused real and measurable harm. The harm, the number of lost advances, the number of lost wages, is the easy part, she said. I sat there, fastening my grandfather's watch to my wrist. What about the lies? Ruth looked at me over her glasses. That's the part you have to be prepared to face publicly. They say the accusations are true. They say you can't have children. To win, you have to be prepared to prove otherwise. I felt a knot in my stomach because I couldn't prove it. My tests came back normal, but normal results don't determine who's responsible for the silence. They only indicate that it's not my fault. I was about to get up and leave, feeling as though I were inviting the city to examine me. Then Ruth said something I needed to hear. "Myra, silence isn't a virtue when you're being fired. Sometimes the best thing you can do for yourself is let them prove their point." I didn't react immediately, but I didn't leave either. I thought about it for 2 weeks. I'm not indifferent. I make decisions slowly, as if I'm reading a sign, and then I decide everything at once. I wrote down everything I was missing, the church community I grew up in, and my situation in a city that already assumed the worst. From the way people spoke to me, they described me as bitter and cold, and as a woman who held a grudge against her ex-husband's family. I knew exactly how this story would end because they had already written most of it. But I wrote the following article: my name, my job, the truth. And the simple truth is that I did nothing wrong, yet I am being punished for it. I kept going back to something. I didn't do it to hurt Mark. If I had wanted to hurt him, I would have had a whole year to do it. I made it clear to the hospital board that the next time my name was mentioned in a room I wasn't in, I would stop believing a false story. That was the line I drew, and I drew it intentionally. It's not revenge. Revenge is an overwhelming, unquenchable feeling. The truth is that someone, somewhere important, has finally decided to keep other people's false promises. I called Ruth before work on Monday morning. I told her I was there. She said, "Okay." Then, swear an oath. I hung up, went into the emergency room, and had the quietest day of the year. The decision itself seemed to be peaceful. Ruth prepared the complaint over the next few weeks. She listed specific statements, dates, and witnesses she had heard from. She detailed the loss of the promotion, the salary change, and the damage to my professional reputation. It was strange to read. All the silent humiliation I'd endured had been orchestrated and calculated, then transformed into something significant. When the news arrived, it spread through the city faster than any ambulance I'd ever driven. Myra Spencer is suing the bishops. Carol was very clever. She told the ladies' club that I was spiteful and malicious, and that the bitterness of my empty house had hardened me. I repeated every word she said, even without realizing it, which was exactly what Ruth had hoped I would do. Mark remained silent at first, as did Paige. But then I started receiving messages. Some were cruel, some were curious, some were quietly supportive, and some were from women whose names had been rewritten by people who claimed to love them. One of them said, "Well, they did the same thing to my sister." I didn't respond to either of them. I went to work and continued to handle the case at the pace of the law, that is, slowly. Ruth told me the next step was for the other party to respond. How Mark's lawyer chose to defend his position would determine everything. She said, "They have two choices. Either they say the comments are just hurtful and baseless. That option is unpleasant, but it suits them." Then she tapped her pen on the table. "Or they raise their flag and say those statements are true. You are the one truly responsible." I pray for whoever chooses that path. "Why?" she asked. The woman smiled, already knowing the answer. "Because then they'll have to check. They'll have to open the door to check." They chose the second option. Of course they did. Mark's lawyer gave an answer that solidified Ruth's position exactly as she had hoped. Their defense, in plain Afrikaans, was that the words spoken about me were true, not slander. I was the reason the marriage failed. They claimed in the letter that the mistake was medical, and it was my fault. When Ruth called to tell me, I heard a hint of joy in her quiet voice. She said, "They only spoke the magic words. The truth is the defense." But that's what they didn't think of. I let her out for a moment. To prove the claim, to prove your infertility, they would have had to present your medical images to the court, and I'm not exaggerating. Reproductive records are highly confidential, and the judge doesn't hand them over easily. We need to convince the court that this is serious and frightening, but you swore under oath that you were the cause. You can't file this lawsuit and then let anyone see it. It's a loophole. It's not easy. It's a loophole. I can work on closing that loophole. I sat down slowly at the kitchen table. What does this mean? It means they increased Mark's fertility, Ruth said. He had been hiding with her for years. He could have given us cause to question it under oath in court. There's no guarantee, but it's the best chance we've ever had. For 6 years, I was the one whose body was the subject of conversation at various dinners and prayer meetings. By trying to make it public, by trying to win the case by speaking publicly in court, the bishops did something none of them wanted to do. He opened the door to find Mark. I thought about how he had ignored temptations years ago, in that heated exchange, and how the subject always drew attention to him whenever it came up. I hadn't said anything to Ruth yet, but I felt a thread I had buried long ago stirring back to life. I couldn't sleep that night. Then I did what I always do when something bad happens. I looked slowly and carefully at the timeline in my mind, as if I were reading an old map of what had saved me the first time. And there, 7 years earlier, On the morning of his wedding, Mark was driving into town for a routine medical checkup. He wasn't there all day. He returned home with an uncharacteristic quietness and humility and poured me a drink before dinner. He never did that on weekdays. I asked him if everything was all right. He told me the doctor was a quack and the whole trip a waste of time, then quickly changed the subject and left. And here's the part that made me stare at the ceiling. After that day, he never mentioned having it re-examined again. Not once. At least in front of the town, he pretended to take the matter seriously. After that, the whole thing was dropped, and within a few weeks, the first whispers about me began. At the time, I ignored it, just as one ignores the emptiness of one's era. I didn't connect it to anything because I didn't want to lie. No one controls who they love. But now, with Ruth's words still ringing in my ears, that quiet day in the city seemed to me like a moment of truth, not just a pointless outing. I had no proof. I wanted an explanation for what had happened. I had bad memories and feelings, things that don't count in court. But that was enough for Ruth to point the finger at me, and that's what she did the next morning. Ruth listened to my story about the trip to the city without writing it down, which meant she was listening very carefully. When I finished, she paused for a moment. Then she said, "It's not serious in itself. It's just a reminder of bad feelings, but it's a reason to ask the right questions." She then explained what had happened, because the other party had raised the issue of my fertility and claimed that I, not him, was the cause. Ruth was able to request the court to produce the relevant medical records for Mark. She said, "If he wants to say it's you, the law allows me to ask him if it is. That's how it works. You can't leave the door half open." I filed the lawsuit the following week. Mark's lawyer defended him vigorously, and that's when I realized I'd hit the nail on the head, because nobody defends anything so fiercely. They argued about privacy, about propriety, about anything that would close the case. A trial date was set, and I was forced to endure the ignorance, which is torture in itself for someone like me. I'm used to requesting tests and receiving the results, but this was different. It was like asking for permission to meet with a judge. I sat in my shift, reading the scanned images, trying not to think about a file I'd never seen before in the city clinic's archives. Ruth advised me to be patient. "The courts are deliberately slow," she said. "It gives the truth time to stop being frightening." I wasn't afraid of the truth. I was never afraid of the truth itself, but rather that they would find a way to hide it from me. Before the judge ruled on the request, Ruth made me sign an affidavit detailing everything. Every statement, every date, every witness who had testified under oath. She placed small, thick, colored cards on the table between us, showing every instance where my name had been mentioned. She said, "Read everything, and then sign only what you know to be true." So I read it. Every single line. The vicar's wife's cooking, the exact words Carol had spoken at the church dinner, the words some of the women had said about not being prepared for this, the board meeting, my lost wages. Reading years of silence in poetry had a profound effect on me. The lie made the truth seem flimsy. I picked up the pen Ruth had given me and noticed the smell of the room. It wasn't the clean, disinfectant-y smell of a hospital, but the smell of paper, paint, and dust from the hardware store downstairs. For years, that hospital smell had meant safety, the only place where no one had ever called me isolated. Now I'm here, in a completely different place. I had to travel to space to get there, and I can no longer hide. I pressed the pen against the line. As I wrote, the delicate gold watch slipped coldly across my hand, and I remembered my grandmother, who always said that patience isn't about waiting, but about knowing when to wait. That was the defining moment. My signature came out clear and precise, the most permanent signature I'd had in a year. When I lifted the pen, it was all over. The complaint was confirmed. The petition was now in effect. Everything that had been in the city file and the device used to access it was now working, and I had started it all. Ruth gathered the pages and carefully placed them on the table. "We're waiting for the judge now," she said. I nodded. For the first time, the wait wasn't a burden, but a powerful motivator. The verdict came on a gloomy afternoon, in the middle of a quiet shift. Ruth called me, and I went to the pantry, my heart pounding in a way I'd never experienced before at work. She said, "The judge agreed, but only to a limited extent." She guided me carefully, explaining everything. Since the defense had stated that the infertility was mine, the court ruled that, according to the judge, Mark's fertility records could be obtained reasonably. It's not automatic, and it's not a court order. The records are released under a protective order, reviewed first by lawyers and the court, and used only when necessary. "This isn't a court order for anything," Ruth said cautiously. "We don't know what's in the file, maybe nothing, but they can't keep it sealed anymore." I stood in that cabinet and let out a sigh that felt like I'd been holding back for 7 years. On the other side of town, as I later learned, the news was delivered in a completely different way. Mark's lawyer requested a private meeting that same day. Carol called Ruth's office twice and was politely informed that her lawyer was unavailable. For the first time, the people who had spent years trying to determine the truth about my physical condition were slightly shocked by the idea that the court would have to decide on the truth about Mark's situation. I didn't respect that. "I want you to understand this. I didn't send a message to anyone." I smiled at myself in the mirror. I finished my shift, checked on the patients, and returned to my apartment alone. But that night, for the first time in months, I stayed up all night knowing the file was coming. And I knew that files, unlike people, don't lie. The first signs of trouble didn't come from Mark or Carol, but from Paige. After a year of silence, she texted me in a state of shock. "Please don't do this. Think about the baby." I read it 3 times. We hadn't spoken since the divorce. "You took my life and my husband away, and now you refuse to talk to me." But then suddenly, she started begging me to drop a lawsuit that had nothing to do with her. That's the rest of the story. It was between me, Mark, and Carol. It was literally about my body, about losing my job. Why would Paige, who has everything to lose, be afraid of this? A woman with a child, a husband, and a home, texting her former best friend in the middle of the night and telling her to stop snooping around? Usually, the people who beg you to stop snooping around know what's going on behind your back. I learned this lesson the hard way last year. I didn't answer. Instead, I reversed the question, sensing the outlines of something I hadn't yet seen. What I understood then, and what I want you to understand if you remain calm in the midst of the storm, is that those most afraid of the truth are the ones who rarely fall. I'm not angry with Paige. I was curious. My curiosity was deep and intelligent. If stories of quiet women finding their inner strength resonate with you, subscribe to the channel so others can find you. And let me know in the comments where you left off, because I was close to quitting. Twice. But Paige's message didn't discourage me. It encouraged me to keep going. A frightened man reluctantly told me there was more to the world than I knew. The file arrived 8 days later. I want to tell you how it happened because it's important. I wasn't the first to see it. I couldn't and didn't want to. I'm a doctor, and there's information I'm not entitled to see. This doesn't belong to my ex-husband, nor to anyone else. It's a legal and proper procedure. The records were properly served to Ruth, as per the judge's restraining order. Ruth read them to the other party's attorney, as expected. Then she called me and asked me to come to her office, something she's never done before. I knew it before I even sat down. She had that wary look you get when someone is about to tell you something serious. 7 years ago, she said, Mark went to a clinic in town, and you remember him. She handed me a piece of paper. Only the lines were legible, the rest was black under the court seal. The result of the test was a word I'd written hundreds of times on postcards: azoospermia. No measurable sperm were found. Mark was told in medical terms that he would never be able to father a biological child. 7 years earlier, in the same week, he had come home in a bad mood, changed his mind, and dropped the subject for good. That same week, rumors about me began to circulate. I sat completely still. After Ruth saw the test results, she watched me while a patient received care. I didn't cry or scream. I felt something immense silently settling inside me, like a bone turning into a joint. For 6 years, I was the broken, withered shame of the Papa's family. The man who had deceived the entire city into believing that the empty house belonged to him. I returned home with that single folded piece of paper in my pocket and I didn't turn on the radio. I had expected to hear news of victory. I didn't want to be one of those who rejoice in the failure of others, so I was prepared for it, even anxious about it. But victory didn't come. What came instead was something strange and sad. It's incredibly sad, almost exhausting. I spent 6 years of my life trying to heal a wound that wasn't mine. The sympathy I saw in church, some women aren't cut out for this remark. Every night I stayed awake wondering what was wrong with me, what I couldn't offer, why my body betrayed me in marriage. It was a story Mark wrote to hide a truth he couldn't accept about himself. He embarrassed me and forced me to wear it in public for years, with my mother holding it in both hands. I've always driven in cars my whole life, so I never said a word to anyone. I said the same thing to Carol in the hospital corridor. Can you believe this? Only now do I realize what I was asking. I asked a woman who was certain she was broken. The answer, the real answer, was in a sealed file in a city an hour away. I wasn't broken. I never had been. The relief I felt from her wasn't like fireworks. It came as a long sigh, like the first deep breath I'd taken in months. And under its weight, a new question arose. A question I couldn't answer. That was the question, and once asked, I couldn't ask it again. If Mark hadn't been able to have a child 7 years earlier, if the clinic had been right, if the diagnosis had been accurate, then that little boy Carol had proudly displayed in that corridor, that little boy Mark died in the delivery room, that boy I'd let my best friend carry, wouldn't have been his son. The calculations are harsh, though not entirely simple. The man diagnosed with this condition cannot be the biological father. While not impossible in some rare cases, it is absolutely impossible without the treatment Mark did not receive. This makes a significant and undeniable difference. Either the clinic was completely wrong, which is rare, or the child everyone in town believes to be Mark Bishop's son is actually fathered by someone else. I didn't know which it was, but I was certain it was a question that demanded a real answer, not just a rumor. Suddenly, Paige's midnight message had become something terrifying, yet simultaneously profoundly meaningful. Please don't do this. Think of the baby. She wasn't worried that my accusations would hurt Mark's feelings. She was worried about what the courtroom, filled with medical records, might force her to do publicly. Because Paige knew something the townspeople didn't. She knew exactly who the child belonged to. It was important to me to do the right thing, so I wanted to be careful about what I did and didn't do. I didn't go there to look through the child's records. I had no right, absolutely no right. The child was innocent in all of this, and I wished him nothing but the best. What I had was a clear struggle, a pure struggle to defend the Bishops. They swore that the infertility was mine, while the records indicate it was Mark's. And a healthy child in another town said that someone was lying about something far more serious than marriage. I called Ruth. I said, I think there's more to it than just land. She didn't even stop. The court wants it, not us. The court, the man who walked into the hospital room that day, like I told you at the beginning, had a name, Daniel Reyes. I didn't know him then. I found out about him the same way I found out about everything else in this story. Slowly and deliberately, through channels that don't lie. During the months Paige and Mark spent together, while Mark publicly declared that she had ended his marriage, it was revealed that Paige was having an affair with someone else. Daniel, a quiet man who was certain the affair was real. When Paige chose Mark, she completely ignored Daniel, blocked his number, didn't tell him about her pregnancy, and didn't say a word about the upcoming appointment or the hospital. She told him he wouldn't connect the dots and dared him to disappear, but the timing didn't sit well with her, so he quietly asked some people they both knew. That morning, neither of them showed up at the hospital for their appointment. So he took her to see the baby he suspected. As she walked through that door, she encountered someone she was certain she would never see again. Paige's face was completely devoid of tears. This is the image I want you to cherish. Carol, pacing foolishly through the elevators, convinced that her son's perfect life was worthless, and 5 steps behind her, she entered the delivery room, living proof that the perfect life was built on the lie they buried me in. For years, I hadn't understood that moment. I didn't even know when it was. I smiled at Carol and asked if she truly believed this. Then a door opened, and a stranger entered. Without me lifting a hand, the house of lies began to quietly crumble. It seemed Daniel had questions he could answer in court. In a town where everyone knew the truth about my body, the truth about someone else's body would be revealed that very day. Mark knew. That's what I mean. What prevented it from turning from grief to forgiveness? He knew he couldn't have a child for 7 years. When Paige became pregnant, he was absolutely certain the baby wasn't his. He did it anyway. He deceived his mother, his church, and the entire world into believing he had fathered a son. His first wife, Barron, hadn't borne him a child. He used a child who wasn't his to complete the story that shattered me. Imagine the pain that would follow. Even cruelty isn't the goal. Or lying about my body. Although that was bad enough. At first, he saw support in seeing the child he knew wasn't his. A confirmation of his manhood. The final word in the sentence he'd written about me for years. To be honest, I tried to find some empathy for him. I'm not a heartless person by nature. But every time I tried, I hit the same wall. He had 100 chances to tell the truth and leave me alone. Instead, he built a fake statue and put a real child on top of it. And Mark's lawyer fell silent when Ruth told me, "No more questions, no more arguing, just let's discuss the deal." I understood why. Mark wasn't afraid of running away from the trial. He was openly afraid of what the boy he'd been boasting about would say about him. He'd controlled the story for 7 years, and for the first time, it was almost slipping completely from his grasp. Carol visited me before the trial. She came to my apartment on Sunday, dressed in her church robes, and I was about to open the door. When she came out, she looked older and shorter than I remembered. She didn't apologize. I want to be honest about this because I've been thinking about her for a while. She stood in my apartment and whispered to me to take off my clothes. She said, "Not for Mark, but for the family, for the child, for his name." As she spoke, I saw something I had never seen before. I saw the woman her son had lied to for 7 years, the widow who had dedicated everything she owned to one child and built her entire life on the belief that he was good. She hadn't uttered those harsh words in anger, but because Mark was kind and reassuring. She had never doubted him because of her deep love for him. I stood in my house for a moment, feeling sorry for her. She was human too, and used to it, but she repeated them again, those words she had kept silent about for years. But this time, her words came not as a statement, but as a plea. "Some women aren't cut out for this, Myra. Why are you dragging everyone down with this?" Even now, she realizes she prefers defending herself to abandoning the lie, even if it means telling the truth. For pity is not the same as giving. I saw her pain, but I couldn't bear to see my son humiliated another day. "Carol, go home," I said calmly. "Clay wasn't my son." She left without a word, and I closed the door without hesitation. I felt like I was finished. Mark's lawyer offered a solution, a peaceful one. They would pay a large sum of money, obtain a personal restraining order against the hospital's board of directors. And if I agreed to collect everything and never speak of it again, they would erase my professional record. Ruth placed the offer on her desk and looked at it. "It's a good offer on paper," she said. "You'll get your reputation back. The board will hear the truth. You can get everything you came for." She was right. Practically speaking, it was a victory. I meant every word I said. I got my reputation back. Work returned to the play. All I had to do was whisper the truth in a room and then lock it in a drawer forever. While Carol delivered her speech in church, Mark continued to boast about the child who was not his son, and the story of the broken doctor remained half alive in a corner of town where private retreats were out of reach. I thought about it long and hard. Then I refused Ruth's request. Not out of pity, I want to make that clear, because change is necessary. I refused because I wanted to see Mark burned. I refused because personal truth is a silent version of the lie itself. For 6 years, they talked about me loudly in churches and at gatherings where everyone could hear. The correction had to stand. There was no room for whispering, no room for hiding. The truth would be spoken once, where it mattered, in front of those who had believed the lie. I told Ruth, "I will not whisper an apology for the harm you caused me. I will say it once where it matters, and then I will be done. Ruth closed her pen and smiled. Then we're going to court, she said. Wear clothes that allow you to breathe properly. The hearing took place on a bright, cool morning in the courtroom. I expected to feel nervous. I can read 1,000 symbols without my hands trembling, but I felt different because this time I was seated at the table. The atmosphere of the courtroom told me everything about how things work in small towns. 2 members of the hospital's governing board were present to observe the proceedings. Several women from Carol's congregation were also there, nodding their heads in sympathy as they had for years. Carol herself sat in the second row. Mark, pale and sweaty, sat next to the lawyer, dressed in clothes that no longer suited him. Paige finally noticed a quiet man named Daniel sitting 2 rows behind her, standing motionless and not turning around. I gathered all the architectural elements that had shaped me over the past 7 years into one room and sat down at Ruth's table. For 6 years, these people had been an audience for my humiliation. They watched a woman have her mouths gagged, either silent or repeating the worst insults. Now, they were an audience for something else. That's what I insisted on, and Ruth understood. The lie was public. The truth had to be public, or it wouldn't undo what had happened. I wasn't there to shout. I'd decided that weeks before. I was there to reveal the truth, and to reveal it in that one part of history, in history itself, where lying comes at a high price. The judge sat down. Silence fell over the courtroom. I felt my grandfather's watch on my wrist, steady and confident, indicating the time I had waited 7 years for. Ruth didn't raise her voice. That's what I remember clearly. In the way she conducted the investigation, she built it gradually, discovery by discovery, calmly and deliberately, until only the conclusion remained. I checked the statements, dates, and witnesses. Carol's own words, spoken at cocktail parties and prayer circles, confirmed that some women weren't made for this. I checked the compensation, the lost promotion, the salary, and the damages registered in my name. Then I turned the defense's case, in which they claimed that what they said was true, and that the infertility was mine, against her. She asked the court to consider the evidence presented by the defendant in the case, specifically making this claim. Regarding the protection order, only the necessary rules were read. 7 years ago, Mark Bishop was diagnosed with a condition that prevented him from having a biological child at a clinic in the city. The room temperature changed. I saw the women of the church looking at Carol, who had changed the color of the paper. Then Ruth, as usual, placed the document the bishops had prepared themselves on the table. The defense attorney claimed the annulment was my fault and said the document belonged to Mark. According to the family's controversial account, the couple had a son. They explained that establishing the child's paternity remains relevant to the ongoing child support and custody cases before the court, and that genetic testing conducted as part of those proceedings has not established Mark's biological parentage. They made this statement with the same calm and collected tone one might read in a laboratory report. Then Mark stood up. "You can't!" The voice echoed through the courtroom. The judge ordered him to sit down. Carol stood up now and called me by name, accusing me, saying that this couldn't be true, that I had twisted everything. They were both shouting and scattering, and I sat motionless at the table, silent. Then Carol turned to me, while the drowning men clung to whatever was closest to them. Her silence vanished. Her confidence in the church dinner was completely shattered, and the only words that emerged from the wreckage were, "Some women aren't cut out for this," she said, trembling and pointing at the room. "But some women aren't like that." She couldn't finish her sentence a second time, so I slowly stood up, because I had waited 7 years and didn't want to rush things. I didn't shout. I kept my voice calm and clear, the voice I use when I have something real and powerful to say to my family, a voice too low for the room to bear. "You're right, Carol," I said. The entire courtroom fell silent. "You're absolutely right. Neither spouse is supposed to have children in this marriage." I let it go. I looked at Mark, then at his mother. The file always had only his name on it. Somewhere in my mind, a song played. My wedding song. Carol chose her. The one who walked smoothly into the church on my wedding day. The one who got caught up in all of this. It meant one thing then. But now it means the complete opposite. Carol's hand fell. Mark put his hands to his face, and the women of the church, who had accepted my downfall for years, finally stood up to them, rearranging everything they knew. I wasn't created by mistake. I was never created by mistake. A city crumbled just steps away from a man who trusted it blindly, and the quiet woman he called broken stood tall. I said it once, out loud, where it mattered, and now it's finally out in the open. What happened next wasn't as dramatic as you might imagine. There was no shouting, and no one raised a hand. The silence was more oppressive, and it was worse for the bishops. Mark didn't deny it again. He couldn't. He sat with his head bowed when the lawyer asked for a recess. He didn't rise when the judge allowed him to. He was the kind of person who would stand there and watch 7 years of meticulously crafted wills crumble. The women of the church gathered their coats and bags and left, their eyes filled with sadness. In the darkness, I realized that the truth would spread through the city as quickly as the lie. Carol, the youngest person I had ever seen, followed them. She hadn't been the leader of the campaign. As for Paige, she had slipped out during recess, but before Daniel could rise from his seat in the second row, she was too close and had walked out the same door. The question about the baby disappeared completely. Finally, I was able to give her an honest answer. I sat down at the table and poured my heart out. Ruth put her hand on my shoulder and said, "You did it without raising your voice. I've been doing it for 30 years. You'd be surprised how rare it is." The measurements came in the following weeks, as usual. Mark's standing in the city, which he had maintained for years at my expense, vanished completely. A trial was inevitable in a small place like this. Within months, he had left 2 states, to a place where no one knew his story. He had spent 7 years convincing everyone of his lies about me, and I had no choice but to follow the truth. It would have been enough for me to say it once, in the right place. The hospital board didn't like what I said, and that worked in my favor. A few weeks after the hearing, the president asked to meet with me. He was one of 2 people sitting in the courtroom, and he seemed nervous and anxious, as if he believed he was wrong. He told me the chief medical officer position was vacant again. He said they'd reviewed the case and that their previous concerns about my judgment and stability were unfounded. He didn't apologize outright, but he came close, and that's all you can get from the hospital board. I accepted the job, not because I was seeking extra profit, but because it was mine, built with my own hands over the years, and I wouldn't let a lie hold me back for another day. In my first week working in the department, I entered a smelly room and inhaled the scent of clean, disinfected cotton. It had once been a safe haven, the only place where no one called me a cave. Now, it smelled different. It felt like a place I'd conquered and discovered, not a place I'd hidden away in. I typed the first code with lightning speed, my hands steady as ever. Then, standing by the sink washing dishes, I saw my reflection in the dark window, no longer recognizing the exhaustion that had once etched my face. It's over. I wanted to tell you I was guilty, and I felt it. But more than that, I felt relieved. Like I'd been carrying a bag of stones for 7 years without knowing it had a handle, and finally someone showed me I was free to let go. People want to know what happened to everyone after that, so let me tell you, and then I'll leave you. Mark, as I said, is gone. The last I heard, he was somewhere in the West, in a place where history hasn't yet been written. I wish him no harm. I wish him nothing more, and that in itself is freedom. Carol lost everything she built herself, not because I took it from her. I didn't utter a word in that church, but the truth about her son was too big to be revealed to the town so easily. The women's club she'd run for 30 years had quietly continued in her absence. I heard she'd stopped coming. I felt a deep, genuine sadness about it, the sadness of someone who chose to lie until everything was taken from them. Paige and Daniel handled the child's case in court the right way. I hope they get a strong ruling in this child's favor. This little boy didn't ask for any of this. Paige and I haven't spoken since. Some friendships don't last. It's not what it seems. I left them with the rest. But I kept my job, my apartment, my watch. I didn't give up anything else. I got what I came for. My reputation is clean. The truth is clear. That was enough. I did one thing at last, and then I was done. I wrote Carol a short letter. Not long, not bad. I imagined her standing in my house, dressed in church clothes. A woman whose son had lied to her, but who had still chosen to lie. And I realized that I didn't want to hold a grudge for the rest of my life. Grudges only cause further trauma, so I made it easier for myself and said, I won't hold a grudge against your son anymore. I wrote. It was simply, you don't deserve this either. I didn't expect a reply, and I didn't receive one. But her words struck a nerve. That night, I took the watch from my grandmother's hand and held it for a minute, thinking that it's not about waiting patiently, as she always says. It's about knowing when to come. I waited 7 years for the right moment. It came and found me. Now time, once borrowed for future calculations, is no longer mine alone. All that remains is my quiet life, finally, entirely mine. If there is one lesson you can learn from my story, let it be this. Truth doesn't shout or chase, it simply waits. On an ordinary day, someone finally stops being afraid and asks the right question aloud. This is my story. For 6 years, I carried a name that wasn't mine, and a silent question that undermined everything. If you're told you're the one who's been hurt the most, let that be a signal for you to stop carrying your name. Speak your mind honestly where it matters, then write it down. If this resonates with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight. Leave a comment, click subscribe, and see you next time.